would not want to keep colleagues here after 15 minutes. You know, you have all given us a lot of your time already. And so very rarely, but I will go to the participants online and let's have two voices in the room. Comrade Trenton. Comrade Trenton is with the LRS in South Africa. Your hand, your electronic hand has been up for quite some time. I hope the question is not going to be that long as the hand.
Thanks, Hod. Vahini, thank you so much for your time. I just want to double click on this moratorium on tariffs on electronic transmissions. I have several related questions that I think you can take as a whole. So the first is, forgive me if I missed it, but just to say very clearly what the status is following the last meet. Was the moratorium renewed, cancelled? Just to restate that. Secondly, my understanding was that this moratorium was separate from the question of taxing these services at a national level. Something you said made me doubt that for a moment. Perhaps you can just clear that up for me. I understand that part of the problem with this particular item is how broad it is. Electronic transmissions is, of course, about the biggest category you could possibly create. So I'm just noting that. The bigger question to you is, in your opinion, just how important is this item to African countries in particular? And because I'm interested in an Africa position on this moratorium and with a thought for the AFCFTA, I'd like to understand your thoughts on that. And then just quickly to share my intuition, which is that, you know, coming from a South Africa as an example of a larger African diversified economy, it makes sense, I think, for us to maybe oppose an indefinite moratorium at the WTO, but then perhaps to support it at the AFCFTA level. On the one hand, to offer a WTO plus situation, and on the other, because South Africa has certain offensive interests that it's well positioned to take on the continent. So, that would be the rationale. I want to be clearer about how a smaller African economy should think about it. Where should they be on this item, especially in relation to the AFCFTA and perhaps also at the WTO level. And then just a last note, I've been quite confused by a very strong business lobby group. Now, I don't know that they represent the whole of the business constituency in South Africa, but they've been lobbying very strongly for the continuation of this moratorium. And I don't really understand why they're doing it. And perhaps you could help me understand their logic. Ostensibly a South African constituency, business constituency. Thank you so much for my slightly elaborate question.
Okay, Vahini, I think you can take that one. Is there anybody else? There's no other hand, so that will be all for the voices from.
Hard. It's Paula. I don't know what's happened. I can't raise my hand, so just consider me after the answer.
Go ahead now, so Vahini can take it all together in some quick 4 minutes.
Okay. I think it's going to be a question. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much, Hod, to give me this opportunity. And thanks to Vahini for this brilliant presentation and take on the MC14. Personally, my name is Paula from Industrial. It was my first time actually being in any WTO kind of platforms, conferences, and whatever. And then from a person who has never been there, I think it was very interesting from my part. And also it goes to show how important trade unions must actually try to get more involved into trade issue. The second issue is that when I went there as a person who was completely oblivious of WTO discourses, I was quite amazed with this at the MC14. to me, it's something that I could take away from this conference. I think it was a big failure, especially for the CSO and then the trade unions, because we really failed to have any sort of platform to kind of, not only put our demands and then also voice some of our concern when it comes to trade issue and a decent work agenda. So I just want to also have your views on this. When it comes to one of the failure of this MC14, the impact. I mean, on CSOs and in trade union. The other very important thing is that critical mineral was off the table during the MC14. And then I like, in your very last comment, when you mentioned that, what we also actually have to discuss is the energy transition, some of the current war and its impact on trade and everything, and then the fact that some of this, even when in Yaoundé the war has started, and we're off the table, and when we know where critical mineral is for instance, for countries,
Right.
DRC, I mean the African continent, I just want your take on this very important issue. Why, at the end of the day, this very important area of work or issue was not on the table for discussion at the WTO. Thank you very much, Comrade Hod. Thanks.
Heard loud and clear from it, Paul. And although we had closed for questioning, I still see a hand. Comrade Vimbai of ZCTU Zimbabwe. So you have the floor. And that will be the last short question.
Thank you, Dr. Hawk, and I appreciate it also for the presentation. I do not want to waste too much time, but I think it was quite a comprehensive presentation. And as I listened, in our efforts to try and make trade agreements work for workers in our region, I then see that even the capacitation which we have done for the last 2 years has not reached any level that can enable the trade union negotiators or trade union leaders to engage with the processes. And listening to Paule, I'm wondering if not only from Vahini, but also from any of the persons here, if there is a way of capacitating which can actually enable a specific group of trade unionists to actually be engaged with trade issues and to keep them to keep their eyes on the ball and to follow up the issues so that the workers and the working poor are not left behind, which is an easy thing that can happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Comrade Vimbai from ZCTU Zimbabwe. And before that was Paul's question and the contributions about the CSOs and the involvement in trade unions at the MC14, which is the regional secretary for Industrial All Africa region. Okay, and then you also had a question from Trenton, director at ALREI. Summarize everything in, if you can, 5 minutes for us. I know it's tough. All right, over to you, Vahini.
Okay, thank you so much. And if I don't have enough time, then I'm happy to move this bilaterally to provide any clarifications. So yes, so thank you, Trenton. So firstly, the moratorium on customs duties on e-transmissions has lapsed. It has lapsed, and we're basically operating in a space where countries are essentially free to introduce customs duties if they so wish. Now, the issue is that there is no definition or agreed scope of what electronic transmissions means. It's never been formally defined at the WTO, despite ministers asking members to agree on the scope and the definition of it, I think over 2 ministerial conferences now. And whenever we kind of try to have the substantive engagement, it always becomes a conversation about should we extend the moratorium or should we terminate it? It's never about what does electronic transmissions really mean and what does it cover. Now, there's a very big context around this because if you look at the negotiating history of the WTO in the early days, when we look at the origins of this moratorium, members had understood it to basically mean it was the bits and the bytes. It was the transport. It was the carrier. So electronic transmissions was basically the carrier and it was not the content. And in 2017, really interestingly, in Buenos Aires, Indonesia, who was at the time probably the leading country who was trying to understand this moratorium, and they were also trying to they were interested in trying to collect data. So they had introduced legislation where they did want to actually levy duties on electronic transmissions, which is why when the Trump administration had come in, one of the first countries that they had secured was with Indonesia to make sure that they do not continue with their legislation to levy duties and that they would support a permanent moratorium in the WTO, which is why Indonesia, it was partly, well, I guess this is part of the reason why Indonesia was silent in the WTO specifically on the moratorium scope. But that's just some context. But in 2017, Indonesia had a bilateral meeting with the WTO Secretariat to confirm what the definition was agreed in the early days when the moratorium was being negotiated. And interestingly, for some interesting context, the former Director General at the time, which was Azevedo from Brazil, was a delegate with the Brazilian delegation during the early days of the moratorium. And he specifically remembered that it had only related to the carrier. And so when they had met the Secretariat had actually confirmed in a bilateral meeting with Indonesia that the scope of the moratorium does not include content. So Indonesia had actually put this language in a footnote, proposing that they would agree to the moratorium to continue in Buenos Aires for another 2 years, as long as we all agreed that it did not include content. But the US had opposed this language, and the moratorium had gone through without any specificity about whether it includes content or not. So for a long while, this ambiguity has served members. But what happened in December last year, I think it was December or November, the US had tabled a submission calling for a permanent moratorium. But in it, they wanted specific language to be agreed that the moratorium includes content. And over the last couple of years, the US has been securing this particular language that the moratorium on customs duties includes content in some of the FTAs with a number of countries. So they wanted to do the same here. Now, that was actually one of the main reasons. Well, it was two reasons. The timing of the moratorium, but also the content of it. So the definition, those became the two sore points, which ultimately led to why there could be no agreement in Yaoundé. Because Brazil, for instance, was only prepared to accept 2 years, and Turkey had said that they cannot agree on the scope of the moratorium, that it includes content, because we've not agreed or we do not have a common understanding. And if I had to take it a step further, I would also argue that the African group would also probably have a similar interpretation that the carrier is very different from the content, because if you look at the AfCFTA digital trade protocol, electronic transmissions is specifically defined. And if you go a little down, I think they also define what digital products means. So digital products is what refers to the content, and the actual transmission refers only to the bits and the bytes. So it's just really interesting. And so there has been no consensus. But just to give you a sense that a couple of years ago, there's been a number of studies, including by the OECD and the ECIPE, where there's it's basically like shifting goalposts or moving goalposts, where electronic transmissions has been so contested because you have like the EU, Australia, Japan arguing that it covers anything transmitted by telecommunications, including over the internet, from emails and software to digital music, blueprints, music, video games, which basically means that the moratorium zeroes out all of your tariff lines in a negotiation that has never taken place because it's an ever expanding universe of products as digitalization advances and accelerates. And India has also been quite a key player in this conversation in the WTO, where they say that since virtually all non-agricultural manufacturing products can be digitized, the moratorium is akin to reducing bound rates to zero on all manufactured products. So there's a lot of dangers around these kinds of interpretations that the moratorium extends to far more beyond what we had agreed in 1998, for instance. And the EU specifically has also said that they want services to be included. Or I'm not sure if it's the EU per se or the OECD who is advocating for a much more expansive definition, which would also bring services under the realm of electronic transmissions. Now, a question from kind of the question about South Africa and potentially why some of the big business or the SA firms might be supporting the moratorium. I mean, if I had to assume, I've seen one or two articles about the potential impacts it may have on MSMEs, or at least a presumption that if there is no moratorium, then it is going to incentivize countries to introduce customs duties. And so there's a fear that there is going to be some kind of a rise in operating costs. But the thing with South African firms, they are overwhelmingly importers of digital services, like cloud computing is, I think, primarily American, or AWS. There's enterprise software, data analytics, cybersecurity tools, video conferencing platforms. I mean, it's not something that we are digital exporters of. So customs duties on these inputs arguably would raise the operating costs. So I'm assuming that for certain capital intensive industries in South Africa, they'd probably see this as obviously very bad for business. And so maybe this could be one of the reasons why they would be supporting it. And I think the bigger worry, and this is also the fear mongering that is happening in the Geneva circles, is that if we don't agree to the customs duties moratorium, then we are going to pass on the costs to South African consumers and businesses. And so it's going to become more expensive for us as consumers of these products. So I believe that there are a lot of kind of exaggerated concerns and fears around certain aspects of it. But I do think that if we were to have a meaningful and constructive conversation, I think we will be able, amongst the entire membership, to try to map out exactly what the interests are, who the beneficiaries are, who the losers are, etc. I mean, South Center had done a study and had shown that in a very conservative interpretation of electronic transmissions, that there would be a significant revenue loss for developing countries. And there's also very specific data on specific developing countries and what those costs would be. And I'm happy to share it with you if you're interested. And finally, just to make a comment about MC14 and some of the issues. I mean, I was there as well, and there was a lot of concerns around the suppression of civil society, and that civil society was not really able to operate the way they normally can at ministerial conferences. So there was a sense because they had kind of put the media together with the CSOs, and you were kind of like all together in a very small space over a number of days. So the conditions weren't exactly very conducive towards the advocacy that the CSOs really wanted to kind of show and to bring some perspective on some of the concerns on the issues. So that was really unfortunate. We've not actually, I mean, we're not civil society as South Center, but we definitely, support a much more inclusive and transparent process for CSOs to have a voice in these platforms. And there's not been any clarity on why this happened. and what they are planning to do to repair this at future conferences. So I think this will be really important as well for trade unions to kind of keep the pressure on ensuring that these conferences are inclusive. And maybe also just to say that the Director General was on record in the WTO saying that the ministerial conference will not be extended. It will end at 1 p.m. on Sunday, the 29th. And they're on record saying this, and across the modalities, it was very clear that this ministerial would not be extended. But when the moratorium negotiations continued, the conference was extended for almost more than 9 hours. And by then, most countries had already left. Most ministers had already left. They had taken their flights. And still, the meeting did not yield the outcomes that they were hoping. So I think this also speaks to the concerns that we as the South Center also have with the process and how things were conducted at the ministerial conference. And we have a number of papers that are on our website as well, trying to kind of highlight and show why we thought some of what was happening in the WTO was not really appropriate, and how developing countries are the most impacted by these dynamics and by the way things were managed. And finally, there was a last question. Sorry, can you remind me what it was?
Recom minerals?
Oh, right.
There
Yes.
was
Well, I guess this just comes back to my point about how the WTO does not want to talk about real things that affect developing countries. And maybe the bigger question now is whether we want to invest so much in these platforms, or whether we should be investing in our regional and more progressive institutions and platforms to address these issues than the WTO. I mean, it's really, really expensive for developing country governments and small economies to keep missions in Geneva and to have negotiators go to all of these meetings only to be excluded, or only to have your issues relegated to the sidelines. And so critical minerals, together with the entire sustainability agenda and the green transition agenda, were not taken to the WTO, despite its immense relevance and importance, which is why there was also the IISD hub, which had dealt with so many important issues on the sidelines of the conference, which was completely separate. It's like we were having two completely separate conversations between what the WTO should be doing and what it was doing.
Wow, thank you, Vahini. It just felt as though I was in a courtroom with you. You've just been releasing the documents and the papers. By the way, there is a question from the platform asking for, is it a South Center study comparing the WTO the agreements? I'm sure colleagues can go to the South Center website. Is it published on
Yep.
South Center website? Yeah.
Yes.
So, colleagues can go there to South Center's website and get a lot of these documents. And I must say, there are a number of very interesting policy briefs there that you could also read and get a lot of insights, on. Well. We have come to the end of today's Trade Union Trade Talks, unfortunately. The 1 hour, 30 minutes plus has just come, in a whim. Because there's been an influx and exchange of information, mostly coming from Vahini, our guest, who has really helped us to understand what went on in Yaoundé and what trade unions, most importantly, can do. And I have taken a lot of cue from, some of the recommendations that you have put forward. But it feels to me as though this is just the first of many other conversations, Vahini, that we should have with you. It looks like we did not finish this discussion. Yeah. So we should find some time in the future to revisit some other trade topics pertinent to us. like the AFCFTA, for example, picking up digital trade and picking up the women and youth protocol, for example, and pitching it against our structure of transformation that we so yearn for the continent and for the youth that live on this continent. So thank you so much, Vahini, again for being with us and sharing all this knowledge with us. And we would not have come together if not for the support of our Geneva partners, Matthias, and the colleagues in the back who have always supported us to get the trade union trade talks TUTT. This is the 4th edition, and we hope to have many more lively conversations, to drive the economic transformation that Africa needs. So let me also thank the participants who have been glued to their sets and been listening and been exchanging on the platform. It has been really interesting having you all. Interpreters, thank you for helping us to understand each other, and that is very important so that there is no communication gap, at least on this platform. So from us here at ALREI, we want to thank you all once again, and have a good afternoon, have a good evening to you all. Thank you again. Bye-bye.